Amy Hill, and I'm going to go ahead and officially get started. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you very much to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center and the Office on Violence Against Women for supporting this webinar series. Just a little bit of background on me. I've been working with StoryCenter for a little over 15 years now, and I co-founded our Silence Speaks initiative, which looks at the role that personal storytelling and participatory media can play in gender equality and gender-based violence, human rights, education, and advocacy internationally. And I also coordinate much of our gender-based violence focused and public health, social justice efforts here in the US. And then prior to working with StoryCenter, I worked in public health for about 10 years, primarily on adolescent health and women's health issues, including a big focus on gender-based violence. So if you're having any technical issues, there's a little frequently asked questions link on the slide. And then again, just to reiterate, after the session today, the recording of the webinar will be available, as well as a copy of the PowerPoint slides with all of the links. So that will be available on NSVRC's, one of their websites. So don't feel like you have to click on all the links as I go through the presentation. You can always visit some of those links at a later time. All right, so before we jump into our content for today, I wanted to just make sure that everyone does know that this webinar is part 4 of a series of 4 sessions, and all the sessions are listed here. They kind of build on each other in terms of the content. If you didn't sign up for other sessions, they, as I just said, will be made available for viewing on NSVRC's campus website. And then again, we did want to just give a quick heads up that some of the content in the webinar may be charged, particularly for survivors. So we just invite y'all to take care of yourselves in the ways you know how to do, particularly when I share examples of stories. So now I will give just a brief overview of what we will cover today. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center will offer some information about their Lifespan project, which is sponsoring this webinar series. And then after that, we'll jump right into looking at the StoryCenter story distribution model to identify the variety of ways that survivor stories can be shared publicly to affect change. And then we'll go over the concept and importance of story framing in terms of how stories are presented publicly. And then I'll present some case studies to give more detailed examples. And then finally, we should have time for questions and closing comments. And since I am going to be talking quite a bit during the webinar, I wanted to begin by sharing a story told by someone other than me. And so this piece was created in one of the many workshops that we've done with Asian Women's Shelter out here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we'll talk more about the project when we come to our case studies. And the storyteller's experience, we can link it back to some of the examples around distribution and framing. So if everybody could click on the link in the slide, that'll take you to a YouTube story where you can watch that story, and we'll come back in just a few moments. So please, when you're finished, if you might respond just with your initial emotional response, feedback, that would be great so that I know when I can continue. So we'll watch that story now. All right, so I see some people are typing into the chat box. Thank you for your comments. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and continue with the webinar. As I said, that story was created in our collaboration with Asian Women's Shelter, and we'll talk more about that further into the webinar. But now I wanted to turn it over to NSVRC, who will be speaking about the Lifespan Project. So I will be back in just a moment.
Hello, everyone. This is Jen Benner from the NSVRC. I am the Resource Development Coordinator. And I just want to quick give folks a overview of our Lifespan Project. This project is our Sexual Assault Across the Lifespan Training and Technical Assistance Project. As we know, people who commit sexual violence do so against people of all ages, children, teens, adults, and people in later life. And all of these folks have very unique needs, and this project is to help advocates and other allied professionals find the best ways for meeting those unmet needs. And so this project, we are able to provide training and technical assistance. We have done a lot of trauma-informed resource creation and promotion. We also support networking, collaboration among folks, and we can give referrals. We have a feel-good Tumblr that folks can check out with a lot of feel-good messaging around self-care. And our website there is listed there where folks can take a look at our products that we have produced and other great resources around sexual assault across the lifespan. And our grant is ending in the end of this month, July 2018, but the resources will still be available on our website. And I will turn it back over to Amy.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. So I wanted to jump right into the model that we use at StoryCenter to describe the potential impacts in terms of change of storytelling efforts. And so over the years, as we've been working more and more with public health and community-based social change partners, we've developed lots of fun and creative approaches to sharing stories. And just to say, we came up with this model as a way to describe the approaches to distributing stories that we're playing out in one of our long-term public health partnerships that began more than 10 years ago in South Africa, but it's really loosely based on the social ecological model for public health, which people may be familiar with. So just to begin with the first light blue circle there on the left, so that really is looking at the impacts on storytellers themselves of participating in a storytelling project. And as I think has probably become clear over the course of this webinar series, for those of you who've been on more than one session, by focusing in on first-person stories, this approach really recognizes that people often lack opportunities to share and bear witness to stories of their own struggles and successes and challenges, or to listen to those kinds of stories of others. And so personal storytelling workshops really are a wonderful way to offer a safe and supportive environment in which people of all ages, from all walks of life, can explore their histories and reflect on how they got to where they are. There are, as we've discussed in other sessions, immense benefits in terms of well-being and healing. And then also the ability to, the chance to describe lived experience can enable people to better understand their current interests and motivations, and it can provide a really great platform in terms of leadership development. So a platform from which to engage storytellers in addressing sexual violence concerns and from which to build their skills as community leaders and advocates. And so in this sense, as I think I've mentioned in at least one of the other webinars, storytelling workshops can function as a form of popular education because they really enable storytellers to connect their own individual life experiences to the broader social, cultural, political context, and can essentially function as a way of building cohorts of community members positioned to speak out. And so as all of this that we've touched on is really germane to storytelling work with survivors who often do lack that kind of safe space and platform from which to speak. So continuing on to the second circle, so that the darker blue circle that I've just brought up on the upper right of the visual here also looks at individual level change, but frames change as a potential result of watching or reading or viewing stories, depending on the media in which they're produced. And so, we've really found that personal stories are incredibly useful for supporting the transmission of information and skills. Personal stories can really stand out amidst all the kind of media onslaught for their directness of emotional expression and their ability to convey, for instance, nuances of language and culture that can speak to very specific audiences. And of course, facts and timelines and more third-person perspectives by expert types can certainly be useful in describing an issue or a problem, but personal stories, if they're appropriately contextualized, can really bring to life the realities of how individuals experience that issue in a day-to-day kind of way. So just, as an example, when people read or see a story that addresses a silenced or stigmatized topic like sexual violence, their empathy response tends to light up. It's those mirror neurons that people who've studied neurological neurology and that whole thing about the mirror neurons, about how when others that we are with have certain emotions, that can spark emotions for us. And so when a safe container is created around how stories are being shared and presented, people's conception of what they can say and what they can do can shift. And this is hopefully where behavior change can begin. And then in the next circle, the brown one that I just have brought up, this kind of expands the model out to look at community-wide change. And so our storytelling work around issues of gender-based violence has really shown that with skillful facilitation, community story presentations can generate really deep and strategic discussions about sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence, and kind of function as an opportunity for people to come together and map out specific strategies locally for how audience members can mobilize and take action on the issues. And so, and then this type of in-person event, of course, can be supported and supplemented by sharing stories in various formats online via social media, through print methods, or on local radio if they're audio recorded, to really reinforce what people have seen and heard at public in-person events, and to reach larger audiences. And in fact, research in public health shows that reinforcing particular specific stories and messages over time can really contribute to social norm shifts around towards healthier views and norms. And if people are interested, I can certainly send a link to in our follow-up email to a wonderful case study of our work down in South Africa with Sonke Gender Justice, which really illustrates this focus on the community-wide change. And then finally, the last circle here describes the impact that digital stories can have as a tool for advocacy. And, of course, in an ideal world in which we don't live, especially right now, people would have lots of opportunities to express their true concerns and needs, and these voices could inform policy discussions. And we've actually found that stories, personal stories and testimony can bring the concerns of people who are typically overlooked into a policy arena. So whether we're talking about public policy in terms of legislation at local, state, national levels, or whether we're talking, for instance, about institutional policies of health organizations, schools, or other community groups. And I think the work of our colleagues at Witness, who use video as a tool for human rights advocacy, is really relevant here in terms of their emphasis in making sure that their material is seen by the right audiences of decision makers, rather than just focusing on, this idea of something going viral and being seen by as many people as possible. So being more strategic. And then finally, just to say, in working with the format of personal stories we've been talking about here, their compact length and their ability to really distill down and zero in on important issues makes them really ideal for educating leaders and decision makers. And then we don't actually limit our policy discussion and focus on the enactment of new policies. We've also seen the tremendous value of personal stories for as ways of informing publics about particular policy changes that have been enacted, and about how these policy changes may impact their lives. And also how stories can contribute to training strategies to ensure that those responsible for enforcement are held accountable for their role. And then just finally, to be clear, with this model, there's a lot of overlap between the circles, and they don't necessarily happen in any particular order. So just to say that. So that's this distribution model that we have used. So how can we, turning now to the topic of story framing, so how can we make sure that personal stories are presented in ways that can ensure that these types of change can actually occur? So, we would define framing as a set of concepts or perspectives about how individuals and societies organize, communicate about, and perceive external reality. And so this, related to stories, it has to do with how stories are contextualized and presented. And so for our purposes on the webinar, I wanted to distinguish between two types of framing: stories, episodic and thematic. And I was initially exposed to these terms by a really wonderful researcher with Frameworks Institute, Susan Bales, and they do wonderful work framing personal stories for advocacy. But the terminology comes originally, if people are interested, from the work of a professor who's now at Stanford, Shanto Iyengar, who teaches in political science there. And I like these two frames because they're really nicely linked to a cultural studies perspective of how individual, that suggests that individual experience plays out as a kind of complicated balance of influence between structure and agency, which is just a fancy way of saying that, people's lives typically unfold through a combination of individual decision-making capacities that are more internally driven, and then the wider structural elements of culture, community, politics, society that either enhance and privilege individual experience or oppress individual experience. And so with these frames, if we refer back to the story that we watched at the beginning of the webinar, we can use it to describe these. So the episodic framing really focuses on individual action and responsibility, and it emphasizes the extent to which people have agency in the world, as I said, in terms of choices they make, and it focuses on single case examples. And so this is the part of the hope story that focuses on the storyteller's own individual life experience. And then thematic framing, by contrast, really recognizes that people's experiences occur within a broader context of social, cultural, political, historical factors. So it points less to individual responsibility and more to societal responsibility for a problem. And so, of course, this is the part of the hope story that broadens out to the fact that gender-based violence is experienced not only on by individuals, but across entire societies, and in fact, all around the world. So that's just a quick introduction to this concept of framing. And so to go into a little bit more detail, so when we're talking about what kinds of framing can be effective for sexual violence stories, we've really found that a combination of episodic and thematic framing is key. And so again, as we just discussed with the Hope story, and in fact, to back this up, this is consistent with one of Framework's recent recommendations on communication strategies, in this case for addressing elder abuse. And I'm going to actually copy and paste this into the chat box because it's a great quote. But essentially that embedding individual stories in larger narratives shifts perceptions of abuse from an individual problem to a societal one, and boosts the public's sense that society can address and prevent elder abuse with systemic solutions. So this type of framing can play out in a few different ways with personal stories. And so if we're looking at how framing can happen, as with the Hope story, a single story can be framed both episodically and thematically. And so stories framed primarily as episodic can really easily be given thematic frames in how they are presented. So important context and backstory and historical perspective that emphasizes thematic elements can be kind of wrapped around the story in terms of introductions, descriptions online and in social media, in supplemental training material, and information presented on websites together with stories, in content included with story presentations, introductory remarks made before stories are shared publicly. Those are really just a few examples of how this can be done. Excuse me. So now we are going to look at a couple of case studies which we've organized based on their primary goals. And so the first case study that I have is focused largely on stories as teaching tools. And then the second frames stories as key to achieving community-wide change. And since at StoryCenter, much of our work with survivors has included not only story circle processes and story sharing and writing processes, but also the development of short digital videos and stories like the one that we watched. The case studies I'm sharing here focus on digital storytelling, but all the ways that stories have been shared within these projects can also be applied just to written stories. So for this first case study, we are not going to watch a story about it because we already did the Hope story that we saw at the beginning of the webinar. So I'm just going to give a bit of information about the project. So I've been working with Asian Women's Shelter since 2002, and they were able to secure funding by integrating storytelling into some larger Office on Violence Against Women training and technical assistance grants that they received. And as we now have done, I think, a total of 7 collaborative digital storytelling projects. So the order and structure of the workshops that we did, the digital storytelling workshops, was really intentional. So we started by doing a workshop with staff of AWS so that we could really kind of equip ourselves with the information that we needed to do some more informed program development, as well as using that as a way to help staff be able to provide, function as good support people to other storytellers in the future. And then after that initial workshop for staff, we really saw that it would be important to have kind of a pre-production day separate from the 3-day digital storytelling workshop. And so this was developed to really prepare participants to speak about issues that tend to be really highly stigmatized and silenced in API communities, as in many communities, but to really support the storytellers in thinking concretely about their stories, and to build trust and secure some good buy-in to ensure as wide a release of the stories as possible. And so we really geared the activities of that towards understanding the project and thinking about information sharing and confidentiality concerns, and thinking about what it means to really represent yourself and your story. And then practicing, kind of the emotion that can come up when sharing stories with a small group, and all kinds of fun activities. And so we have found that the most widely usable or released stories were those made in these projects specifically by survivors who were not super recent clients of AWS and its partners, but who were staff, volunteers, language advocates, hourly workers. And so these were people who were kind of not right in the middle of their trauma stories, who were not really still struggling to rebuild their lives at the moment in really real and practical ways at the time of storytelling. So they were better positioned to participate in the actual workshops. And I'm not going to go over the workshop methodology because we already did that in one of the earlier webinars. And also, if people are interested in the digital storytelling methodology, we have a workshop on, another free hour-long webinar on, it's basically called Digital Storytelling for Public Health. That's happening in November. So if you're interested in the specific workshop methodology that we use for participatory media to develop these videos, I would encourage you to check that one out. But I'm just going to focus on how AWS has been sharing the stories that have come out of the workshops we've done with them. And so, AWS uses the stories primarily in trainings in their organization for their own constituencies, as well as trainings locally and nationally on cultural humility and culturally based approaches to addressing gender-based violence. They've used stories in trainings for attorneys, trainings for local and federal law enforcement, prosecutors, training for bilingual advocates, and then, of course, presentations at conferences. And the stories have really been geared towards helping audiences understand complex realities faced by API women who've experienced gender-based violence in both cognitive and also emotional levels that can really stick, and that can really result in more of a commitment and motivation to address the issues. And they've really been transformative for audiences. The training evaluations have shown that they've really supported people in understanding and realizing viewpoints from limited English proficient survivors who rarely, if ever, have the chance to have their experiences heard and shared. So that's the AWS project. If people are interested in more information, there's a short case study through the link, and I can also certainly share more of those stories if people would like to email me after the webinar. So let's go on to our second case study, which looks at how first-person stories can play a role in shifting social norms, both at community and institutional levels. So again, let's go ahead and watch a story. So people can either click on the link in the slide to view the story, or you can click on the link in the chat box or copy and paste the link in the chat box into a new tab in your browser. And please, if you could just, when you're finished, just note your initial feelings, emotional response in the chat box so that I know when to continue. That would be great. So let's watch that story now. We'll come back in a few minutes. I'm going to go ahead. So that story was created back in 2011 through a collaboration funded by the Global Fund for Women in Nepal, and it was a partnership with Sati Nepal, which is an NGO based in Kathmandu that has quite a long history of doing gender-based violence intervention and prevention work, and in Nepal. And we initially had framed the project as an opportunity to make women's personal stories the centerpiece of efforts that they were spearheading there to push for adoption of legislation addressing domestic violence. But as we were waiting to hear back from the funder, that law actually passed. So then we re-envisioned the project as one that would focus on social norm change and policy education, so people could understand the need for community change, and so for women to be able to know and understand their rights under the new law, and then also to support accountability for those different actors responsible for enforcement. And so specifically, we held a 4-day digital storytelling workshop in collaboration with Sati in Kathmandu, with 8 young women sharing stories like the one that you just saw. And one challenge with the project relates to how difficult it was to carry it out at all in terms of being in the context of a country and global region where the severity of gender-based violence, as I'm sure people are aware, and the stigma attached to it are quite severe. So we had really hoped to work with survivors who had already made some progress in rebuilding their lives, to support them in reflecting on how they got to that point. But the stigma around the issue was such that not a single one of the former clients that Sati approached was willing to share a story. They were done, and they were afraid that coming out publicly about what they had endured, even when we assured them that we could leave out names and any recognizable images, they were really afraid that this would jeopardize their current situations in life. And so we ended up working instead with current residents of Sati's shelter, some of whom were very clearly in the earliest stages of coming out of abusive situations. So we were, so as I've emphasized in some of the other webinars, we were really careful to do good screening of the potential storytellers, and also we engaged some of the counseling and support staff in providing extra emotional support, and we took things really carefully and slowly. I had a counselor do some art therapy with the participants, so you saw some images there that the storyteller actually drew herself. And then during the process, we built in lots of icebreakers and fun activities and kind of movement-based activities to really break up the seriousness of the stories and get people into their bodies and get them moving. So, to address the somatic dimension of trauma. And then we did a really nice ritual at the end to honor the women and the stories. In terms of distribution and sharing of these stories to create change, the success has really been in how widely Sati has been able to share them. So we worked with Sati to create a story discussion guide that really frames the stories as key vignettes in the context of training activities. And then since we did the project, Sati has shared the stories quite extensively in trainings, again, just like the AWS project, for health providers and law enforcement officials on the domestic violence law and other laws that criminalize gender-based violence, and then also in community level screenings to raise awareness about the issues and talk about the need to shift social norms and talk about what that could look like. So to support healthier norms that can condemn gender-based violence. And then also education for women about their rights under the law. So those are just some of the ways that those stories were shared. If people are interested in the discussion guide or seeing additional stories, please feel free to email me after the webinar. All right, so we do have time. I think we have about 15 minutes now for some questions and answers and discussion. So just to say again, this is the last webinar in this series, so this is your last chance to ask questions in the online format. So if people would like to just type questions or comments into the chat box, I'm totally happy to respond as the questions come up. And then just as a reminder, with this webinar series, we had invited everyone to explore this idea of developing a writing from a first-person perspective by sharing some of their own stories. And so we did receive quite a few stories that I'm working with people to suggest some small edits and whatnot, and that we hope to publish on our blog. And so that is still an open invitation to everyone who has signed up for the webinar. And I'm happy to circulate around the specific story prompts that we had suggested when I send a follow-up email. So I'd really love it if more people might want to take an opportunity to write something from their own personal perspective about experiencing or witnessing or addressing gender-based violence, sexual violence. That would be really great. So, so we do have time for questions. If people have questions, other comments, concerns, I'd love to hear from you. I'm wondering if anyone has had some experiences of working on story sharing activities or story writing activities either before or since the webinars. I'd love to hear about what people are doing. So feel free to address those. So I see some people are typing. All right, great. That sounds fantastic. So Allison runs a writing group in a regional jail. That sounds fantastic. I love it. One of my favorite projects I did was similar to that with San Francisco Women Against Rape. We did a writing group, 6-week writing group, where we didn't have any prompts, but we had different kind of tactile activities that we did to prompt story sharing and writing that led up to digital storytelling. So it was a great way to kind of ease people into the digital storytelling process and to sort of avoid that assumption that any kind of creative output or creative process for survivors should necessarily focus on the violence that they endured. And so people had a lot of freedom to really write about whatever they wanted to. So I think the questions would be around purpose. So if your purpose is really to be working from an art therapeutic or narrative therapeutic perspective, then having very content specific messagey type stories is not so important. But if you're interested in creating stories to really impact particular issues, community perspectives, myths, stigma, policies, then that's where you'd want to have the more directive focus on prompts that would help people write about directly about their sexual violence experiences. So any other questions that people have? So I'm going to skip ahead. I know they're, again, NSVRC, I thank them so much because they put together, for those who are interested, a really great set of references for this webinar session, like the others. So I'm going to bring that up. And then let's see, Elise has a question here. Or no, just some sharing. Young people and sharing their stories for our website. That's great. That's excellent. So I'm super glad that the webinar series has been helpful. Please reach out if you have any questions or need any feedback or anything about what you're doing. That's wonderful. And we're always looking to, point to and support different projects however we can, develop collaborative relationships. I don't know if people have seen the follow-up emails, but we are inviting anyone who's interested to sign up at a discount for the digital storytelling workshops that we offer. So if that's of interest to you, you can keep a lookout for that. All right, so any final questions or comments before we end? Well, so I think our time has just about come to an end. So I wanted again to just thank everyone who took the time to sign on and participate. And I hope this session and all of the sessions have been useful in some small way. I know it's really difficult to glean a lot and to go really in depth in the webinar format, but hopefully some information and examples and guidance has come through in a way that can support what you're doing. And we do really support people reaching out for further assistance and potential collaboration. Yeah, that's a great comment. Thank you, Lynn. Absolutely. There's a wonderful book. I think I probably mentioned it early on, but if people are interested, there's a great book called Writing as a Way of Healing, How Telling Our Stories Transforms Our Lives. I think that's what it is. And it's by a professor, I can't remember her name, but she's at one of the SUNY or CUNY out in New York. So I can include a link to that in the follow-up as well. So yeah, please reach out, and we'd love to do more with NSVRC. So it'd be great to hear from everyone about what they would be interested in. And so if you could please complete the short survey for us, that would be super helpful. And I've just pasted it into the chat box, and then it will also be, it'll open up when we end, maybe it won't open up when we end the webinar. I forgot that NSVRC set up this particular platform. Anyway, you have it in the link in the slide, and I'll probably send it in a follow-up email. So thank you so much, everyone, and I'll hope to hear from whoever is interested in exploring other ways I can support you. Have a really wonderful day.